So, a few photos to share with you as usual. Sardis is not a place that I have been, but some interesting photos to be found on the internet. Sardis was situated in the middle of the Hermus River Valley, or what's known these days as the Geddes River, about 4 kilometres south of the river itself. Its citadel was built on Mount Molus. There it is. So the mountain there, you can see the citadel's built near the top, not on the top, but near the top. While there's also a lower town in the river valley itself as well. This is a picture of the Temple of Artemis. And you can see where it's closer to the top of that mountain we saw in that other photo. And this is the gymnasium. History of Sardis. In the 7th century BC, Sardis became the capital city of Lydia, which is the whole of that region of Turkey. But then it was conquered by Cyrus the Great around 547 BC. If you think about the book of Daniel around that sort of time, and the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, all of that stuff, that's around this time this is taking place. And then in 334 BC, Sardis was conquered by Alexander the Great. Obviously, it was a very important city, being the capital of the region. And then 219 BC, it passed to the Romans. Now, if we go into the text of the Bible, this is what we read. In verse 1, it says, "I know your works, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead." Now, it connects in my mind to what we read from Smyrna, a couple of letters previous, where it says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." There's that connection between death and life there. But I wonder if when you look at these photos, do you notice anything about them? It is deserted, as most ruins are. I just notice how green it is. How green it is. It really contrasts with the previous ruins and photos that we've seen. It's just really green, lush, and located in this river valley. And I just wonder whether that's connected to this appearance of life that is spoken of in this chapter. I've got nothing definitive to say that there is a connection, but it just reminds me very much of that. When we look at what Swedenborg writes about this chapter, and bear in mind this is the beginning of chapter 3. We've had 4 letters in the previous chapter, chapter 2. Swedenborg seems to change gear here. As I've read through chapter 2, I've found it quite easy to make a personal connection with what's stated, what he writes about these words. It's easy to see there's an application for me in it. When we come to Sardis and then the churches that follow, it seems as though he gets more into the kind of historical groups of people that existed. You know, so he's saying this is about this group of people, this is about this group of people, and this group of people. It was much harder to make a personal connection. So my question was, well, what is the personal connection here? So I'm just going to do a quick recap of where we've been. So we started in Ephesus. And in Ephesus, Swedenborg writes that these are people who are in the knowledges of good and truth. And what we spoke about a few months ago is being in beginnings. This is the beginning of the journey. This is where we start. It's a relatively external state. We're learning facts and figures. We haven't got to the point of applying them yet. Okay, so that's Ephesus. Then we move on to Smyrna, and he says that Smyrna represents those who desire understanding. So this is awakening to a greater reality. You know, we've learnt the facts and figures, but we've started putting them together, and we're starting to see kind of new vistas opening up to us, a new expansive way at looking at the world. If you remember, we talked about moving out of a little library into a bigger one, a bigger sense of something greater going on in the world than what I know. So we desire understanding. We move on to Pergamos, and he says this is people who are in temptations. with this awareness of these new inner realities, these new landscapes that are opening up to them, they're starting for the first time to see what is negative about themselves. They're starting to see the way, oh, I'm not as good as perhaps I thought I was. One of the things that occurs to me looking back at this is Swedenborg uses two phrases, very similar. One is the evils of falsity, and the other one's the falsities of evil. This one, I think, Pergamos, is the evils of falsity. In other words, it is the way that a false idea can mislead you into behaving in ways that you should not. That's the evil of falsity, so to be misled by a false idea. Whereas when we move on to Thyatira, he writes, this represents people in whom internals and externals make one. Now, remember, if you do, from last month, we talked about the figure of Jezebel and her misleading of people. And I think this is the other one of those phrases. This is the falsity of evil. So this is where, when you have an evil desire seated in your life, it makes you see the world in a particular way. That's moving from evil to falsity. Okay, so we see the world in a particular way because of something that exists in our own heart. And you need to get rid of that thing in our own heart in order to then have your vision of the world cleansed, as it were. So, today we move on to Sardis, and he writes this. It's a little bit longer. He writes, those who live a moral but not a spiritual life, because they have little regard for the knowledges of spiritual things and for intelligence and wisdom therefrom. And that's what we're going to explore. So the thing about this is all of these cities are about a recognition of something within oneself. You think of the name of this book, a revelation. This is what is going on here. It is to reveal what is going on within us that previously we were unaware of. So what's going on here is recognizing that our the external part of us, is fundamentally dead unless there is a spiritual part which is enlivening it and leading it. So the spiritual part of us needs to drive our natural action, our natural behaviour. And indeed, it goes to the point of realising that actually without the Lord, we are dead. We have an appearance of life, but that's all it is, an appearance. It is the Lord within that must drive us if we are to be truly living. Now, last week, I talked about regeneration, reformation and regeneration from true Christian religion. And one of the things I didn't talk about was True Christian Religion, paragraph 591. He says, the internal man first must be reformed, and by means of it the external, and thus man is regenerated. So we regenerate within first, and then our external life is regenerated. And I wonder whether Sardis is the beginning of the regeneration of the external person. It's the beginning because this is where we first see that the external actually needs to be regenerated, that it is dead without the Lord. So, my talk to the children this morning, I mentioned the helmet, and I hope you spotted the relevance here. So, in verse 2, of Revelation chapter 3, be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die. For I have not found your works perfect before God. If you will not watch, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know what hour I will come upon you. So this theme of not knowing the hour is present throughout the New Testament. I read something similar in Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, verse 39. If the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. And Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the sign of the times." In Matthew's Gospel, you have a couple of chapters, 24 and 25, which are known as the little apocalypse. And he says in there, "But of that day and hour no one knows." The parable of the wise and foolish virgins, which again is part of that little apocalypse, Matthew 25. "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." And if we were to continue reading in Revelation, we'd find the same similar words. "Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." It just reflects a way that we can tend to live a natural life without a spiritual one. We live in an empty way. We think about what I can get away with, rather than acting out of the conscience that we should behave in, the way we should behave. So I look to get away with my test, with cheating in my test, rather than realising actually you shouldn't cheat in your test. We go through the motions of religion with no real impact upon our heart. It makes no difference to the way we behave. And what happens is we have our heart driving in one direction and our head driving in the other. And our actions contradict what is actually truly in our heart. We're really only keeping up appearances. There are those who have an outright denial of anything spiritual. I wrote an article for the forthcoming newsletter about interactions with atheists that I've had on social media in the last couple of months. And they're reflected in the Bible. I think of other people in the Bible who say they don't know. Pharaoh is one. Pharaoh speaking to Moses said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." And that idea we find through the text of the Bible as well. The Pharisees, the same thing. They do not know the Lord. For a person like that, spiritual states don't exist. And you can't watch for something if you don't know it exists. But for us, the real problem is this external practice of religion. As though the rituals themselves do anything. Just turning up at church does anything to us. It doesn't. We need to change our heart, and it's the heart that the Lord is working on. The knowledge of spiritual things doesn't do anything for us. It's becoming spiritual because of those knowledges that's so important. And if we don't become spiritual from the knowledge that we have, we face the same danger as the person who just denies the spiritual entirely. There becomes very little difference between us and them. Okay, a practical application of all of this, because I know it can feel very intellectual in some ways. The difference between internals and externals. I want you to think about the difference between words and meaning. You see, when we hear someone speak, isn't it so easy to react to their words? And we forget that they're trying to portray a meaning. You see, what happens is we take a word and we define it in a particular way. And we think that what they mean by saying that word is what we think they mean. It isn't. That's us putting our meaning into what they say. They have a meaning that they are trying to portray by using those words. And we forget that communication is not just the use of words, it's actually the conveying of meaning. So instead of reacting to words, which we do so quickly, we need rather to listen for meaning and react to that. It is the meaning that someone is trying to portray that is so important, not the words themselves. Now, this can work both ways. We can react negatively on the spot when someone says something we think we disagree with, and we can put people offside by doing so. On the other hand, we can react favourably to someone who says what they think we want to hear, and not actually recognise that perhaps there's another agenda in there that we need to be wary of. We need to listen for meaning. And this is the difference we're talking about here between the external, the words, and the internal, the meaning. Now, the same is true of action and intention. And there might be many other ways we can look at the way people behave in this way. We need to connect with people on that internal level, not the external one. Since a person's internal and external can go in opposite directions, it is clear that a murky spirit can live behind a shining face, and a fiery one behind a smooth tongue. Therefore, my friend, you must get to know a person not by his mouth, but by his heart. Now, when we talk about our relationship with other people, we can see the importance of knowing someone by their heart, not their mouth. What we have to realise is the same is true of us. The same principles apply. It's the internal, it's the motivation that is so very important in our lives. It's that drives what we do and what we say. And that needs to be our focus, to make that alive. Life is about being real. It is about truly living, but not keeping up appearances. It's not about the way it looks. It's about a thoroughgoing application of spiritual principles through our whole life, in our heart and in our actions. It's about living as an open book, but it's a spiritual open book. You know, anybody can be an open book. You can have someone who has the cruelest of hearts who is an open book. But we're called to have a gentle, soft heart, one open to the Lord, and also an open book. And I think for me that is the message of Sardis, is to bring the inner and the outer together. Realise the outer on its own is dead. It's nothing. It requires an inner life, and it requires the Lord behind it.